All right. Good evening. This is After the Revolution, a review of architecture's massive consequences. Tonight we have a new guest, Ytasha Womack. Ytasha Womack is an award-winning filmmaker, author and journalist, and choreographer. She's author, creator of the pop-futurist, Afro-futurist novel 2212 Book of Rayla. First of the groundbreaking Rayla 2212 series. Her other books include the critically acclaimed book Post-Black, How a New Generation is Redefining African American Identity. Another one is Afrofuturism. Another one another one that she co-edited is the anthology Beats, Rhymes and Life, What We Love and Hate About Hip Hop. And as a Chicago native, her film projects include The Engagement, which she directed, Love Shorts, which she produced and wrote. Ytasha is currently an editor of the cultural news site Post-Black Experience and a guest editor for NV magazine. And she will be shooting this fall a film called Bar Star City?
Yep.
All right. Okay. Well, thanks for coming.
Thank you.
I would like this conversation to address generally the idea of organization, especially in African American culture. I'll say why, because this exhibition entitled Architecture, the Georges Bataille Architecture, Chicago and World Order, is an attempt to try to see how the concept of architecture could be read differently, but through Georges Bataille. He claims more that architecture is the concept by which we order reality, the way an ideological order would order reality. And the idea of organization then becomes very important to me in this prospect, because the claim, again, of this exhibition is that if there is an order that is being applied to reality today, I claim that it is Milton Friedman and neoliberalism. And neoliberalism, I would claim again that is one of the main achievements of neoliberalism would be to have destroyed the capacity of the people to organize, with union bashing and so we have been talking a little bit before together, and I was interested in this idea that came up in our discussion, which was that there would be a long tradition of African American capacity to organize.
Right.
How would you describe this?
Right. Well, it's interesting. If you look at just Chicago in and of itself, Chicago is a place that has I would say, a unique African American community, because you have so many people whose families came up through the Great Migration. They lived in what we now call Bronzeville, so there was a lot of overlapping community for a very long time. And as things expanded, people still primarily were around the South Side, a lot of the West Side, but the organizations that came through these communities were in part to facilitate survival, and came out of necessity. So I just think it's, for some reason, sometimes when people look at our community, there's not always this understanding that you have a very long tradition of people being highly organized. And I think the politics of the city kind of lent itself to that. But I think it's strengthened even more because you had this high overlap of people who were coming here for opportunity through the Great Migration, of course. And, they had a wider range of freedoms. And in so doing, we're able to create some organizations that, in a lot of cases still exist today. What's sort of interesting about a lot of the organizations that came out of Chicago on the South Side in particular, whether they were church-based or whether they were tied to, even something musical organizations. They always had a social activist component to it, professional organizations. You can look at, say, the National Association of Black Journalists, which was, I would say, founded in the 60s. I mean, that was created here in Chicago as well. But that was an outgrowth of the Chicago Defender being here, right? And then you had other black newspapers that existed as well. The Chicago Defender was, well, it still exists today, but for a very long time it was a daily newspaper, and it was around for, I would say, almost 100 years. So, I mean, there's a history there of being able to, disseminate information, to be able to work across interest or party lines, to be able to get things done.
Yeah. And so, one of the reasons I'm asking this also is because, in this exhibition I refer to a book that we talked about, Max Weber's Protestant Ethics and the Spirit of Capitalism, in which basically he claims that there is a particular sociology of Protestantism, which through the doctrine of predestination, the Protestant people would then have to have success in what they're doing in order to know exactly what they're supposed to be doing on this earth. But then another structuring point of Protestant belief is that you should not show off, and so then if you make money but you don't spend it, then it generates capital. And so a particular kind of ideological framework, i.e. Protestantism, then generates a particular kind of way to organize, and it's part of a deep culture. And so when we're talking about the capacity of, or a long tradition of African American to organize, to structure, do you think that where would this come from, according to, do you think it's really based from after the new story of African Americans once they are in the U.S.? Is it brought back from Africa? Is it one of the remains of the deep anthropological structure that remain despite this big violent process? Or where would you originate it in terms of maybe an ideological, deep psychoanalytical framework of the people?
I would say it's a desire to form connections. I think with, if you're looking at people, say, coming from Africa, and then you have the transatlantic slave trade and, many of the things that took place, there was a strong desire to connect along family lines and to create community in the face of, a lot of incredible challenges which undermine community. So I think when people had obviously more opportunities that they fought for, no doubt, which came from people being organized. A lot of it was a statement of resilience, but it's also a desire to connect and to be able to create your version of how you feel your community should exist. So, not to mention just a larger perception of the community as not being sophisticated, so that was a challenge that people had. One of the things I talk about in the book Afrofuturism, when you look at things historically, people of African descent, for a very long time in the country had to prove that they were human, and in so doing, one of the primary things that people do as a statement of their humanity is to create community. And obviously, community, that was something that was very much undermined for a big part of our history. So coming to a place like Chicago, where people are, at least through the Great Migration, are in these situations where they kind of have to be around one another. Of course, there's going to be statements of expression around identity, around who you are, and looking at how you can change this narrative, how you can achieve power. Not just power within the Black communities, but power overall. And there are a lot of different philosophies around that.
Can you explain a little bit for our viewers what Afrofuturism is?
Oh, yeah, sure. Afrofuturism, it's a book that I wrote, but it's about looking at possible futures or alternate realities through a Black cultural lens. So it covers the arts, it covers, it can be a way of self-liberation, but it's a concept that a lot of people are very excited about. So if you look at, sci-fi writers like an Octavia Butler, all the way to, artists like a Sun Ra or Janelle Monáe, they all engage in what we now call Afrofuturism. But Afrofuturism is a concept that's existed for a very long time. And, it's just within, say, the 90s that the term Afrofuturism evolved. And now people are really embracing that term to look at kind of Black culture and our relationship to the future.
So would you say that the long tradition of organizing of African American people would be also a long tradition of alternative organizations, or that Afrofuturism is more a new kind of an alternative way in which alternative ways of organizing amongst the African American people has occurred?
Well, I think it's probably twofold, because a lot of the organizations that were created out of in African American communities were done so in the face of people undermining the ability of the community to organize, right? Mm-hmm. So those become statements of protest, statements of identity to organize. Now, the structure of some of those organizations were probably traditional in the sense that they were very top down. You had one leader, you had your infrastructure of support for it. So it was not, all of those organizations were not necessarily alternative. But in that, I think that there were a lot of groups of people who experimented with other ways of organizing. But that said, I think it's kind of interesting, and we may have mentioned this in the conversation before, how, within the city of the South Side, a lot of these major institutions, when you look at the actual buildings they're in, you can't identify them from the outside of the building. If you're just, you're driving down the street sometimes in the South Side, people can say, oh, what am I looking at? But, signage is not necessarily, very major. You don't have things with a lot of bright colors.
You're talking about the South Side?
Generally speaking. Yeah. Generally speaking. Unless something is a church, right? Yeah. When you have a cross. But outside of that, any kind of business, organization, if they're in a building, they're really not positioned in a way where you can identify what it is from the outside, which to me is, in that way, it's very non-traditional. Because usually if it's a business, if it's a certain organization, you say, oh, here's the organization, we have a big fat sign, we are here, right? And I wonder if sometimes that's done as a way of protection, right? So that if there's this assumption that people don't want you to be organized, or if you feel there's some sort of threat, about who has power and who doesn't, you don't want to make these very grand, flashy statements from the outside of the actual building.
I think one of the questions that I'm trying to do is this whole exhibition and this TV show is about, to me, how much of reality is design, or how much of it is sort of chaotic? How much of ideas have impact on the construction of reality? How much can we plan things so that the world will be different? Or for instance, when you have Afrofuturism, you open towards. There's that quote here, which I find very beautiful in your book, that you take from Ingrid Lafleur. I generally define Afrofuturism as a way of imagining possible futures through a Black cultural lens. Possible futures. I think mainly what this exhibition is about is really trying to see if architects, instead of today being part of consolidation of capital, or dismembering communities through policies or whatever, we could use our very long tradition of top-down thinking, which is mainly what architects have been doing, to come up with propose alternative narratives of alternative futures than the neoliberal order which we're doing. And so while saying this, I'm really going back to this question of order and organization about African American communities. I'm really interested to try to see how much there would be of a Black part of it into it, or an inheritance about white structures within it. This sounds stupid now because we've spent our time saying that either Black or white did not exist, but somehow they do exist as ideologies, right. and they. So how would you?
What's the mix there?
How would you? Yeah, would you find a? And it's always very critical. That's why maybe it's a bad question, but. it's always very critical to substantify or to identify a particular culture with a particular kind of trend. But when it goes to ideology, going back to that Protestant, I was discussing with Terry Clark, sociologist. He was saying, part of what's very important, what Ytasha does, is that he believes. It doesn't make the same people whether you believe or not. That's been disregarding, color, race, or if there would be is there such a thing possible to identify as a more African American or black type of organization or mental framework of organization, in the same way I guess you were starting to say about non-linear or non...
Right. It's an interesting kind of focus, because I think, and we had mentioned this, African American culture is uniquely American, right? Mm-hmm. So obviously there's a lot of ties to the African heritage, but a lot of that was remixed, once people were here, and then expressed in part through, the different, European groups and Native American groups that were here as, people kind of evolved. Yeah. I think a lot of the structure for a lot of these organizations, maybe in one sense, generally speaking, was, Eurocentric in terms of, or very westernized, let me put it that way.
Westernized.
To some degree, in terms of the top-down concept of things. I do think, though, that, particularly with Afrofuturism, there is this real question of looking at other sorts of alternatives and how they function, right? With respect to the structures and how people sort of operate. I think that when you look at some of these institutions and organizations, I would probably bring up that the reliance on intuition with some of these institutions, not that it's always vocalized, but I think people are probably culturally more open to using that as a guide for how to do things, right? So in westernized frameworks of how you would structure something, there's always a plan. Yeah. You have the plan.
And that's
you follow the plan.
Architectural.
And we're all taught that, right? You have a plan, and
when you write, you have to have a plan.
Right, and then be able to do so. So I think that there's more of a understanding, and I'm speaking generally here, around a certain kind of flexibility, where embracing that, there's more acceptance around embracing a certain flexibility to move forward. And so the organizations, generally speaking, are probably structured in a way where you have maybe one person doing 4 or 5 different jobs. And someone can say, well, is that person qualified to do that job? And you say, it's not about are they qualified, it's about this needs to be done. They'll figure it out, right? So I think that there's a flexibility around working with a wider range of people, some of whom may appear to have talents in certain areas, but if they don't, there's the thought of, hey, if they're here in this group, we're going to find a role for them, because we have to get this job done, right? As opposed to, they're not qualified. Right. And even in terms of working with certain organizations, certain Black organizations, locally, there seems to be, when you start talking about this whole concept of who's qualified to do what, there's a bit of a resistance there. And I think some of that, comes from sort of this tradition of, you did have people who were domestic workers, maids during the day, who were then leading usher boards, or who were heads of major, women's societies, right? And so
it seems that the left, to me, and I would say even more so in the US than in France, from what I understand, does not have the ambition to come up with an alternative system. That there would be, and I'm talking about the US because a lot of reforms, I think, are envisioned as being as a grassroots system, which to me seems like there would be the recognition of this system, the top system, that would still be there, and you would dialogue with it, but you would not challenge its existence. It would be still, top down, as a dynamic like this. Whereas I think, and for instance, I like Slavoj Žižek for that, when he's saying, I don't have the time to go vote every day, I have books to write. And so I would like just, to have an alternative system. Some guys did it for them, it works for them somehow. Can't we come up with an alternative system to us? Like have the ambition to at least try to have another idea than just, instead of, perpetuating this dance of, like we're not happy with what we're doing. And so I get the feeling that I have the intuition that from what you said, or it seems that Afrofuturism has this kind of pride or this kind of, let's say, ambition to come up with seriously different alternative futures, regardless of how they might be appearing as feasible or not. Is that the case? Or?
Yeah, and I think because there's this whole conversation around space and time within Afrofuturism. When it comes to concepts of time, one thing that kind of separates Afrofuturism from, I guess, kind of Western orientations around science or sci-fi is that, the concept of the past and the future are very much one. It's like everything's happening at the same time. And you have other, maybe spiritual practices that point to that sort of concept. And I think that also kind of plays into narratives around like space, right? There's how you view the world around you, and then there's how it's physically seems to manifest, right? So there's the idea of creating your own reality, and you can create your own reality despite, say, the seeming physical limitations that are around it. So for some people that can be, this, you could say, oh, are they living in an imaginative world if they're choosing not to see the things around them as they're supposed to be interpreted, right? So if you live in a neighborhood that's very challenged for one reason, you're supposed to accept that it's a challenged neighborhood and, embrace that you're in that and you see yourself as a person navigating through it, right? Or if you look at it differently, as many people do, if they're residents of it in some cases, how does that change how you perceive yourself and how you ultimately navigate? So, but in that, you're not necessarily physically constructing new spaces, right? A lot of it comes from your own identity of self and how you relate to your own world. So I think Afrofuturism in some way points to that. I think metaphysics and, certain new thought philosophies very much kind of tied to that. Other, esoteric traditions kind of point to that. Are you creating your reality, or is it being
imposed on you?
Exactly. Yeah. So, and I just kind of, so I think in that sense, yes, there's this space dynamic.
But isn't there, for instance, this idea that there would be the conquest of another planet for the black people or something? That seems rather ambitious.
Well, I don't know if it's just for black people, but
but in Afrofuturism, no, I thought that there was one of the ideas that were in the sci-fi.
Well, yeah, sure. There's different sci-fi stories that talk about certain things. William Hayashi wrote a book called Dark Side of the Moon, that's very much about a separatist black society that lives on the dark side of the moon.
Okay.
And there's a trilogy there. Yes, there's a song called I Want to Leave This Planet. That was a jazz song. And it was pointing to all of the struggles in the planet and saying, hey, I don't think we can change things here on Earth. We just want to go somewhere else. But then you have this narrative of like a Sun Ra, or who talks about, hey, I came from another planet. I'm really from Saturn and I'm living here, and my mission is to enlighten people through music. And the reason that I'm having this sort of alien experience here is because people don't know how to deal with these wonders that I'm sharing, right? And that's how he explained metaphorically some of the challenges within race, that he came from somewhere else.
It's funny, like, David Graeber?
I don't believe so.
He's an anthropologist. He was part of he's the one who apparently came up with the sentence, we're the 99%. He was part of Occupy. Okay. And he wrote extensively, and he's a bit like Zizek. He's a weird guy, but he's very interesting. And he has this sentence, like, he's an anarchist, but and he always said, like, if you want to start to be an anarchist, you just have to act as if you were free, which is, a self-fiction that seems to echo what you were saying. Like, say,
right.
but it's a fiction that actually, if you start with the assumption that you would lie to yourself, but in fact you might actually become you might become it because it's actually a fiction that might be imposed on you too that you accept or something.
Right. No, I agree totally, because people, I don't think you know what concepts of limitation you have until you start viewing yourself as totally free. And then you look at what you wouldn't do or what you would do. And of course, sometimes race and culture can play a big role in that. But beyond that, just how people, the limitations that they have around themselves. One thing that makes Afrofuturism kind of interesting is that for people of African descent, they get to challenge their notions of who they are, right? Or who they've been told that they are. But that again translates to everyone, right? If you're a person who's not of African descent, and you're thinking, gee, why don't I know about the different contributions that people of African descent have made to science? People are, so you're still challenging notions because we're all given these storylines and narratives about who someone is, if they're black, if they're white, if they're American, etc. So yeah, I can totally see. I think the concept that you mentioned, totally relates. Well, just one thing, I think, and I don't know if I shared this when we were talking about organizations. I don't know if there's always a recognition of just the value that a lot of the organizations within the African community have had for the resilience of the community, for the lifeblood of the community. Of course, for the survival of it, but that these organizations and systems very much, were lifelines. They were training grounds. And I think that, when we tend to, there's a certain narrative around the American community, and sometimes that narrative is that people aren't organized, right? In the face of, incredible.
That's general knowledge.
Right. But it doesn't point to that many of our successes are very much tied to a very sophisticated level of organization. I think it's about looking at all of the organization in the face of all the things that people were fighting and combating. And when you look at it that way, you're like, wow, how'd they do that, right? So then it becomes kind of this magical experience, but then that goes back to frameworks, right? And people, for a host of reasons, choosing not to look at it that way. These organizations, whether you're talking about schools, religious institutions, social service groups, they were very much created. It was a few people who were very determined. They created these places because they saw that they were of value and very necessary for a certain kind of resilience, for a certain kind of expression, and unusually committed. Without a lot of financial resources to do so. Especially when you look at some of these places that have been around for like 100 years. They were not working with a lot of money. They were, just highly dedicated people, a lot of volunteers. I mean, I'm amazed sometimes, even when I look at certain churches, how many people are paid staff. It's a handful of people, and volunteers are like in the hundreds, right? And they're almost working like double shifts, double jobs, right? I just think that that's not always acknowledged.
And I think that's the very reason why I wanted to talk about organization, because I'm fascinated by it, and so I'm very, very happy that you say that, because it's true that I don't know, I did not explain this, but it's really fascinating. This extreme, like the expertise in organizing and mobilizing in a large variety of forms.
Particularly when it comes to social justice. Particularly there, I mean, it's almost automatic. I like to say that if Barack Obama had not come through Chicago, I don't know if he would have become president of the United States, because of a lot of these sophistications and the range of organizations and structures, right?
And that goes back to that very first question that I was asking, which is this architect. That's really, I guess, the way to sum it up a bit. I'm really wondering again, what is the architecture of the black? type of organization? What is its DNA? That's really what I'm like. That's what
I know, and that's something I probably have to explore.
Yeah. No. But I think that's
right.
what we've been doing. But I think
Right.
because I think there's a specificity about it. And you touched about it, like even like the fact that there's this energy of volunteers, for instance, or like you've covered a lot of aspects of it, but it seems that there's really a singular architecture, which somehow seems to be an alternative to this top-down architecture that Georges Bataille is describing, and so it's the entire. Maybe the solution is there for the problem that he asks. I think, and so that's why I'm really fascinated. All right, so we're gonna wrap it up here. Thank you, Ytasha.
Thank you. This has been fun. I appreciate this. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, and tune in. There will be more. Bye.